Can you hear me?
Yes.
Outstanding. Thank you. Thank you for attending, sir. Andrew Kreitz. I'm an Army cadet at UCLA. As I think we pretty much all know, over the course of the last couple of years, of course, we've seen much greater success in Iraq thanks to the surge, thanks to revised counterinsurgency doctrine. And a large portion of that success rests on the fact that we've managed to work very successfully with moderate Muslims, Sons of Iraq, et cetera, to work against the extremist elements of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Yesh al-Mahdi, et cetera. The point being, don't we risk alienating, in order to combat this threat, we obviously can't just exterminate populations and we can't force everyone
Nobody's
to
saying
convert
that.
or anything like that. Certainly not. I'm not implying you are either. My point here is that in order to be able to win this war, we need to be able to moderate the Muslim world as a whole and cast out the extremist elements. Do we run the risk of alienating that population by taking too hardline a stance?
I don't think we run any legitimate risk by speaking the truth of doing anything that would cause damage. I don't think that fantasy-based policymaking is ever wise. And if it is true that the Quran and the Islamic tradition and Islamic law and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, all teach warfare against unbelievers, and it is true, if it is true that Muslims around the world are acting upon those things, and if it is also true that there are other Muslims who actually oppose those efforts and are willing to work with the United States, then I can't see how they could possibly be offended in a legitimate way if we speak honestly about the fact that those elements exist. And if they really oppose them, then they would not be angry at that kind of talk, but they would welcome it as reformers.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, Steve Lindsay, Princeton University, and I suppose my question kind of will go a bit off of the previous. I was wondering if, given two sort of different perspectives at the Islamic faith in general, one I've at least seen articulated by Andy McCarthy, being a general skepticism of Islam because of its corruptibility, versus something like Jennifer Bryson, who has actually done studies for the military concerning possibly it being in the United States' interest to find and to study Islam in the more mainstream reformist view of it. And Bryson is a conservative and working at a conservative think tank. And if you feel that there's any plausibility to that kind of compromise, or even if there is common ground.
I don't think that there can possibly be any real basis for common ground without knowing where we're setting our foot, without understanding what we're dealing with fully. And so, in the first place, there's been a lot of talk, and I'm not speaking about Jennifer Bryson in particular or anyone in particular, but there is an awful lot of talk among conservatives as well as among others about moderate Muslims and moderate Islam, without really understanding, without ever having any clear definition of what would constitute a moderate. And so you have outlandish things like Dalia Mogahed and John Esposito in their book, Who Speaks for Islam, which is essentially a Gallup poll, an international Gallup poll, determining the attitudes and assumptions that prevail in the Islamic world. And they classify as moderates those who think that the Jews are behind 9/11 and America deserved what it got. I think they're cooking the data a little bit there. And that's not the only place. The United States government has pursued a policy since 9/11 that essentially amounts to, if you're not blowing something up right now, you're a moderate. The problem there is that completely ignores the stealth jihad I was referring to in the talk, that there are groups that are trying to advance the Islamic agenda, but by peaceful means. I think that the violent peaceful distinction is useless, because precisely that there are these groups that exist, that you have people like Omar Ahmed saying, we want the Quran to be the only law of the land in the United States. Even though Omar Ahmed will never blow anything up, I still consider that under the oath of office that Barack Obama took as President of the United States to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, he should see the movement to make the Quran the only law of the land as a threat to that, and ought to apply existing sedition laws to it. But Omar Ahmed is generally classified as a moderate, and so are others like him. And so, look, in theory, it seems to me that sure, we could work with real moderate Muslims, but we have to define our terms very carefully. And I think the only way we can do that is to speak honestly and say, look, you know, the Quran does say, fight against even the Jews and Christians until they pay this jizya, this tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued, which has always been understood in Islamic law as meaning this subjugated status for non-Muslims and this institutionalized discrimination against them. And we know that Muhammad said to wage war against unbelievers. And we know that all these international Islamic movements say to do this and to pursue this war by various means, not always hot war. And so, you, sir, Mr. Moderate Muslim, will you repudiate those things, please? Will you come up with some spiritualized understanding of these things that make them benign? And do you affirm peaceful coexistence on an indefinite basis with unbelievers in a free society that does not institute any religious law as the law of the land? In a society like ours where we have the non-establishment of religion. And if we can get an affirmation of that in deed and in word, then I'm happy to work with a guy like that. The problem is that those kinds of questions aren't ever even asked in the public sphere, because of political correctness and because of ignorance and because of the disinformation campaign that is part of the OIC stealth jihad.
Thank you.
Mark Eastham, the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. I think we have a major problem in the Middle East where all of the pro-democracy movements are almost all Islamists, wanting to see an Islamic State and caliphate and all the rest of it. And I think we have a major problem of, do we either support medieval regimes that suppress Islamists, or do we support democracy and risk having Islamists win? And I was just wondering what your solution to that would be.
Well, that is the Hobson's choice, because you're absolutely right. While the Islamic terrorists have been characterized as a tiny minority of extremists who are repudiated by the vast majority of Muslims worldwide, in reality, whenever there have been relatively free elections in the Islamic world in recent years, the people that want to see Islamic law imposed in the most draconian way generally come out the winners. And there are large majorities for that. And so supporting democracy as such ends up supporting the imposition of Islamic law and these institutionalized discriminations that it involves. And we've seen that in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as in Gaza and elsewhere. And so the question becomes then, the alternative, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States opted to allow for the imposition of Islamic law and the installation of Sharia, Islamic law, as the highest law of the land, is stipulated in both the Iraqi and Afghan constitutions. And so that's one method, and at the same time the United States is also doing the opposite and contradictory thing by supporting the Mubarak regime in Egypt and the secularists in Pakistan, the Musharraf regime and then Zardari now. And they are working against the imposition of Islamic law, at least in its full force, in Egypt and Pakistan. Neither choice is good, really. And it would seem to me that in a larger sense, if we are committed primarily to the defense of the United States and of our allies, that we don't really need to be funding these regimes at all, and don't need to be sending money to them, which is kind of stupid and suicidal to start with. We've given billions of dollars to the Pakistanis since 9/11 to fight terrorism, and they have turned around and given that money, a large part of it, to those terrorists they're supposed to be fighting. And this has been documented even in the New York Times. And so why do we keep giving money to them? Barack Obama's response to that revelation was, well, we have to give them more money so they can fight the terrorists. Well, you know, if I beat myself on the head with a mallet and then I say, gee, it hurts, I guess I'll beat myself on the head with a mallet some more. It's ridiculous. And so this is the situation that we're in. I think we should stop